there we go. Good morning and welcome back, everybody. We have with us on the line Gary Kybell from Davis and Gilbert. And Gary has been talking about the Facebook FTC settlement. And now you were getting into the piece, Gary, about apps, privacy and apps. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Take it
So
away and explain it.
I was running through about 4 or 5 parts of the complaint from the FTC. Then I'll run through the 4 key parts of the settlement. So finishing up the parts of the complaint, one program that Facebook had was called Verified Apps, where if you downloaded an application through Facebook, Facebook will kind of give it the good seal of approval. Think if you ran your own website and you had third-party software on the website, you might tell your users, this third-party software is acceptable. It's safe. It's been tested. The complaint from the FTC is that there was not sufficient testing of those apps to consider them verified. And the last part of the complaint actually had to do with the US-EU Safe Harbor privacy framework. For those of you familiar with privacy issues, the approach in the European Union is very different than the United States. And personal data cannot be transferred from the EU to the US without putting certain steps in place to meet the EU's more stringent privacy requirements. Part of the complaint was that Facebook did not meet this standard, even though they were alleging that they did. So let me now move into the settlement. So Facebook did sign a settlement, not agreeing with everything that was in the complaint, but agreeing to take certain steps. The first thing, and there are about 4 key things that Facebook agreed to do going forward. Number 1, Facebook agreed quite simply not to make any further misrepresentations about how they will use personal information. So when they tell a user that information will be kept secure or will not be shared with a third party, that must be accurate. One interesting part of that settlement is that in defining personal information, the FTC included IP address. That's actually been a somewhat controversial issue as to whether or not an IP address is personal information under U.S. law. There is no specific U.S. law that says this. In the EU, again, the approach has been much different, but treating an IP address as personal information is becoming more and more the trend. Second part of the settlement is that in the future, if Facebook is going to make what we called earlier material changes to their privacy practices, and these practices exceed the expectation that a consumer would have through setting their privacy settings on Facebook, Facebook must get an opt-in from the consumer, and here's the really important part. The FTC says the disclosure to the consumer must be separate and apart from the privacy policy. This is the FTC telling us that privacy policies are not the be-all, end-all of privacy. We don't think consumers read them. We think that they're sometimes too lengthy, too confusing. So if there is something important you need to tell a consumer about privacy, pull it out of the privacy policy. Put it on a pop-up or on the screen or maybe in an individual email. But the FTC is very concerned that burying information in a privacy policy, no matter how accurate the information may be, is not sufficient. 2 other last parts of the settlement, they have to designate specific employees to be charged with managing privacy. And most companies of any size will have a chief privacy officer. So Facebook divided the chief privacy officer task between 2 people for products and for services. And the last thing, and this is always the killer, that the settlement agreement has a life of 20 years. Now, that sounds kind of crazy because obviously 20 years ago, Facebook didn't exist. The internet was only being used by math professors on campuses. But a settlement with the FTC always lasts 20 years. What that means is that you are under the terms of that settlement for 20 years. You also have to submit audits every 2 years by an independent third party proving that you're in compliance with the order. There is one part of the order that says Facebook can come back and petition the FTC to change the settlement if technology changes in the future. But some of us in the privacy industry sometimes find the 20-year requirement a bit, silly or interesting, considering how rapidly technology changes. So, I mean, that is the FTC settlement, in a nutshell. I think it's important for a number of reasons.
Well, why don't we get into that right after this? Because
Sure.
we're right up on the